Hello, Global Studies 9. Today we're looking at Judaism. So what do all 6 of these people have in common? Yep, you probably guessed it. They are Jewish. So the early origins of Judaism can be tracked about 4,000 years ago when people settled in an area known as Canaan. It's a map of it, and it's roughly what would be modern day, maybe you've guessed it already, modern day Israel, as well as parts of Syria and Jordan. Now, the holy text for this religion is the Torah, and Christians call the Jewish text the Old Testament because Christian writing is the New Testament. So to give you an idea, here's a visual. The Christians are using both books, the Old Testament and the New Testament, whereas the Jewish people are just using the Old Testament, especially with a focus on Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Now, when you compare the two, the Old and the New, you'll notice the emphasis is a little bit different. So in the Old Testament, there's more emphasis on Israel, the king, the land, whereas in the New Testament, it's more about God, Son, and Christ. Right? It's more about the Holy Trinity, something we'll talk in more detail when we get to the part of Christianity. So again, a few more differences. Old Testament's in Hebrew, whereas the New Testament is in Greek. The Old Testament focuses on the start of mankind, while the New Testament is mostly about Jesus Christ and what He's done for us and what we can learn from Jesus. Now, Abraham is a key character in all 3 Abrahamic religions, including Judaism. The story goes that he was born in Ur, and he created a covenant. So he promised God that if he leaves his house for God, that God would provide him with a nation. And he was the one to start teaching people the concept of monotheism. So if you remember talking about Sumeria and a lot of these other ancient civilizations, they tend to be polytheistic, right? Many gods, whereas he began to preach for the concept of just one God. The story goes something along the lines that God wanted Abraham to prove his loyalty to him by sacrificing his eldest son, but right before he was about to sacrifice his son, God says, okay, I understand how loyal you are, that you're willing to sacrifice your son for me. So that's the story of Abraham sacrificing his son, Isaac. A key character of Judaism is Moses. So Moses is said to have helped free the Jewish people from the Egyptians. So the original story goes that the Hebrews, the Jews, were originally accepted into Egyptian society, but eventually they were forced into slavery. So after a while, the Hebrews really want to get out of Egypt. And a movie that illustrates the story is Exodus, Gods and Kings. You'll have time to watch it in class. And here's a scene from the movie. This is obviously after the first of the 10 plagues comes to become a reality. The Egyptians are kind of getting nervous that these plagues are coming true. So speaking of plagues, there were 10 total, and all of them occur, and by the time the 10th one occurs, when firstborn Egyptian boys begin to die, the Egyptians at last agree to allow the Hebrews to leave Egypt. Now, once Moses leads the Hebrews, the Israelites, out of Egyptian slavery, he comes across Mount Sinai, and there he receives the 10 commandments from God. So these include commandments like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and we'll look at more details during class time. So he begins the first kingdom of Israel on the land of Canaan. As I mentioned earlier, there's not much water, it's very dry, there's lots of deserts, but nonetheless, the first kingdom is created around 1000 BC, it's roughly 3,000 years ago. So the first king was Saul, followed by King David, and the third was Solomon, who's perhaps the most famous of the 3 kings, because during his time, the Hebrew people were able to build many temples in Jerusalem. However, building all these temples created a lot of tension between the north and the south. There were a lot of temples being built in the north, and as a result, those in the south revolted, and the area got split into two, north being Israel, south being Judah. The name Judaism actually comes from the word Judah. Now, by 700 BC, so just a few hundred years later, Judah and Israel begin to pay tribute against a much stronger group of people known as the Assyrians. They hoped by paying money to the Assyrians they wouldn't get attacked, and this was true for a few decades, but eventually Israel, so the northern part, gets taken over by the Assyrians by force, and then a few hundred years later, Judah also falls by 570 BC. So following the Syrian conquest, the Babylonians then take the place of the Syrians as the new controllers of Israel and Judah. However, there was one small positive period when in the mid-500s there was a Persian king who took over that territory, and he actually allowed Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild temples. So to this day, in the 21st century, Jewish societies still thank King Cyrus, who's actually a Muslim, for his kindness for allowing Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem during this time to help rebuild temples. Now around 66 to 70 BC, Jerusalem is controlled under the Romans, and there's a failed revolt that kills over 100,000 people. And around this time, there's something known as the Exodus, where Jewish people spread all around the world. Right? They no longer have a home, and this continues on for over 1,000 years. So now we're going to jump way forward, almost 2,000 years, up to the 20th century, where the territory was being controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but has now been given to the British Empire at the end of World War I. And once the British Empire takes over, they're no longer a Muslim state, so Jewish people are able to migrate much easier in comparison to the time when the Ottoman had control. So the Jewish population during this period increases to over 300,000 people. Then in 1947, the UN has a plan to partition this state. So what that means is they want to give Jewish people some territory and Arab people some territory. The Jewish people originally accepted this proposal. They were happy that they would have some land, but the Arab states did not like this proposal at all. Right? They felt like this is Arab land. It has been Arab land for thousands of years, and it does not make sense that Jewish people come in after thousands of years to take half the territory. This led to a civil war, also known as the Arab-Israeli War. The Israelis were victorious, so ironically, once they won the war, if you go back to this first screen, the Jewish state actually ended up taking more than they had originally planned after they won this war in the Arab-Israeli War. A few decades later, there's the Six-Day War. So again, similar situation where the Arab states attack Israel, but then the Israelis end up winning, and as a result, the Israelis end up occupying even more territory than they had before. So this part of the world continues to be divided. Palestine, so Muslims controlling part of the territory, and the Israelis, the Jewish people, controlling part of the territory. There's water disputes, there's illegal settlements done by Israelis, but at the same time there's Arab political groups constantly shooting rockets into parts of Israel. Fighting continues every day, and it's a very, very heated issue, and without an immediate solution in sight, because the Israelis want everything, but at the same time the Palestinians also want everything. So dividing it in half does not seem like a possible solution. So at the moment, things look pretty grim in the Middle East, especially Israel at the moment. So this is an interesting graph showing how the state has changed, especially since 1947. So you can see that original plan, and then after the Arab-Israeli War, clearly Israel gains quite a bit of territory. Then you have the 6-Day War. You can see Israel gains a little bit more land. And then today, it says 2012, so it's roughly today, it's a few years ago. But you can see how Israel is growing. And Israel continues to grow by settling in those yellow territories that are meant to be Palestine. So one final interesting demographic I want to share is the state of Jewish people in the world today. So as you can see, most people who are Jewish are either American or Israeli. In fact, roughly 70% plus of people who are Jewish in the world are either American or Israeli today. Finally, there is a really good crash course video on Israel. I recommend it. You can check it out. Link is at the bottom of the page. Here is a copyright disclaimer. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.